Well, first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for organizing this event, which I think is very important. And I am really glad to see increasingly, well, particularly in London, now that I moved here, the organization of Marxist feminist events. It seems to me that there is a resurgent interest, which is obviously great and very welcome. So I took a few notes because in this intervention, what I want to do is to take Cinzia's book as a point of departure to raise some issues concerning what I see important strengths and limits of Marxist feminist theorization, at least what I consider some of these strengths and limits. Obviously, for time constraints, this intervention will be very sketchy, and you will also see that I will concentrate on the limits, not because I think that they overshadow the strengths, but because I think it's probably more useful to try to see the problems, especially the problems we had in the past in certain ways of theorizing, in order to find some solutions or reflections on them, rather than to have or to assume a self-celebratory attitude. So you will see, probably will do more of that. First, I'd like to say for those who haven't read it that I think Dangerously Alone, Cinzia's book, is very, very useful, precisely because it is conceived as a critical introduction, concise introduction, which, in my view, was missing so far on the many debates between Marxism and feminism. I thought also the book is very effective in the way it is organized as a chronological theoretical journey into the many episodes of this love-hate relationship between Marxism and feminism. And for instance, as Terry was saying, I found the historical chapters, the first two chapters in particular, particularly compelling, in a way because they reminded me and they stimulated me to go back to this hidden history and very concrete history of women's attempts of organizations, victories, but also defeats vis-à-vis the workers' movement. And I found this very, very useful because it's that very concrete history which is often forgotten or overshadowed sometimes by reflections that are detached from more historical accounts or social reality, and at least in certain ways of theorizing on Marxist feminism. So I found the historical part, I think, is very, very important and useful. Said that, I would like to raise today some points that have been stimulated particularly by the chapters of the book dealing more with the reconstruction of the theoretical debates. So I will concentrate on them. I should like to say at the outset that I'm not talking about limits of the book, but I'm talking about limits that reading these chapters in the book made me reflect upon. It's something I think about myself in my own work on intersectionality, anti-racism, Islamophobia, Marxism and feminism, and so these chapters made me think of, made me further reflect upon some of the limits I see into, especially the classical part of Marxism, feminism, which I think still inform part of contemporary or more recent, let's say, theorization. So I think first it is very important to remember or to think how much of Marxist feminist debates on the nature and origins of patriarchy have been informed by anthropological research. So just think from Engels, the origin of the family, private property and the state onwards, anthropological studies have been a very important source, especially for classical Marxists, seeking the roots of the hierarchy between the sexes, but in the end also as a way to assess the major explanatory power of class and the division of labor over gender and gender relations. But I found myself thinking, what does this mean? How does anthropological research informed the debate and shaped the debate within Marxism and feminism itself. Recently, this reflection was further developed after a paper that was given at the HM conference by the Canadian Marxist feminist Abby Bacon. And for those of you who don't know, Abby works on issues of precisely of Marxist feminism, migration, and so forth, particularly in the Canadian context. And it was very interesting to see how Abby reminded or informed us, for those of you who didn't know, how Morgan's account of the Iroquois society, and as you know, Morgan's account constituted the basis on which Engels wrote this classical book in Marxist feminism. So Abby explained how much of Morgan's account were themselves based not only on very imprecise understanding of that society, but even worse, on very strong Eurocentric and even racist assumptions. Obviously, Engels didn't know. I'm not saying that Engels incorporated that, but it's interesting to see how many of these sources available to early Marxists were very biased in this way. So I think, in short, in Abby Bacon's compelling reconstruction, Morgan fundamentally assumed the inferiority of indigenous collectivities' ways of life and based his research on these premises. But I think this is important to keep in mind because it teaches us a lesson, at least in two directions. So first, I think it's important to remember because anthropological research, particularly in the 19th century and early 20th century, as we know, was fundamentally a colonial enterprise, serving the needs of the colonial metropoles to perfection their tools of domination and exploitation of the indigenous populations. So an acritical absorption of these sources into a Marxist feminist account run the risk to import precisely those biased assumptions into a theoretical framework, which obviously, on the contrary, wanted precisely to overcome them, those biased assumptions. But I think one should also notice that anthropological accounts inferring the origins of human organizations from the observation of indigenous populations and their ways of life, obviously could never be genuinely historical accounts. They, in fact, were not based on historical sources, but most of the time precisely on inferences. But more importantly, we should remember they were based on the observation of contemporary coeval indigenous populations in that present of the 19th and early 20th century. And this operation, obviously, was very problematic, not only because it assumed that indigenous populations were somehow remnants of the past, living remnants of the past, but also because this was at the basis of a dangerous, if you want, a teleological way of thinking, or a philosophy of history, one that thinks that history is a continuum and the present is just somehow the aim of the goal starting from the past, to be very simplistic. But I mean, just to keep my point, this attitude is very dangerous because it operates according to what a critical anthropologist, Johannes Fabian, called temporal distancing, which assumes that there is a distance between indigenous populations in the present and Western societies, so that the social experience of the indigenous populations is projected back into a temporality which constituted the past of Western societies. And this has been very obviously at the basis of much of developmental theory and the colonial thinking and so forth. So I think it's, for me, was an important element to think about. This brings me to my second point, which is the problem of seeking the origins of patriarchy, particularly if this search of the origins, as I said, is based on these very problematic sources and even research ethics, if you want. So just talking about the origins, I think Foucault had a point here when he criticized the search for origins as a way of constraining history within predetermined teleologies that in the end only served to confirm the present as this uninterrupted evolution from the past. So from this searching for the origins perspective, gender oppression in the present becomes only the result of this kind of original sin in an archaic past not one really knows much about. So gender oppression, it seems to me, if this is a perspective, risks being eternalized rather than historicized, and the history or the different histories of women's liberation become a continuum from past to present, from which we don't see the ruptures, the moments in history in which women actually organized themselves and there were moments of liberation and so forth. But I said Foucault, but one does not necessarily need to turn to Foucault, because I think that we can find in Marx's writings himself, a profound critique of teleological thinking. So for Marx too, in many instances, the search for origins in order to reconstruct the rationality of the present was fundamentally a mistaken methodology. One for Marx does not need to depart from the past, but from the present in order to understand the past. And as he wrote, in the anatomy of man lies the key of the anatomy of the ape. So I think this is also an important lesson that we can learn from Marx's writings themselves. Now, going to my conclusions, the reason I'm putting so much emphasis on these problems, this reliance of Marxist feminism on anthropology, teleology, and so forth, is not so much for theoretical or abstract thinking or inclination, but I think the structure of Marxist feminist debate, according to this anthropological and teleological register, has created two major problems. One is well identified by Cinzia's book when she says that the problem is not to seek whether gender comes before class or which one is more important for our understanding of capitalist domination, but rather to grasp the interrelation in capitalist production, and especially to understand how we can combine them in a political project of liberation. And the second major problem, deriving from all these elements I tried to outline, is that I believe these Eurocentric and even racist sources on which much of our understanding and classical Marxist understanding in the history of gender and class has been based, mostly unwittingly, as I said, not consciously, but how this played a role, perhaps we should think, if not in the neglect and sometimes active underestimation of race and racism, even within Marxism itself. So in a way, race and racism, like gender and sexism, have been treated in orthodox Marxism as a secondary or derivative forms of oppression as compared to class and class exploitation. But I think this hierarchical thinking has had the result of alienating to the cause of the workers' movement, not only the feminist movement, but also the anti-racist movement. And I don't think we need to go back to the 1970s or the 1980s to see how these problems continue to haunt the Marxist left. And we can think of, I think Terry was mentioning this as well, we can think, for instance, about the headscarf controversies in France, and in which many Marxists, in my view, failed to see an opportunity to engage in a genuine anti-racist battle. But I also have to mention here, I think also of the case of rape allegations against a member of the SWP here in this country, which in many ways again demonstrated the deep problems in which, and even the contempt in which some Marxists continue to hold the feminism and the cause of women's liberation. So we are talking about very concrete contemporary issues and problems that we need to deal with. So I will conclude here just to say that I see some very positive developments and reasons for hope for a renewal of what, or a creation of what Cinzia calls the queer union between Marxism and feminism. I would like just to mention perhaps two, and the first is that I am one of the organizers, together with other comrades, of the Marxist feminist stream at the Historical Materialism Conference here in London, and it's been really fantastic to see how much in the last 2 years, particularly when we started trying to build this feminist presence in the conference, how many feminists are there interested in Marxism, working on Marxist feminists from very interesting and also new perspective, and in a way to see this new young generation of feminists who are taking up so many problems, sometimes from a very fresh and new view, is very encouraging. And the second point also of hope, and here I close, is that I see much interest now amongst Marxists in the problem of intersectionality and the problems of racism, race and racism in particular, that I see as a very positive development, and again, that made me think that it's possible now. It's a good conjuncture for a renewal of Marxist feminism thinking. Thank you.